Okay, let's get started because we have a few preliminaries and we want to be attentive to time today. Um, Welcome to members of our community and other friends near and far who are joining us today. This is the Dean's Lecture and Concert Series at St. John's College in Santa Fe, and I'm Walter Sterling, the Dean of the college here. It is my pleasure to welcome my friend, David Satran, who's going to be speaking today on homecoming, home leaving, ancient paradigms, and modern reflections. Before I say a bit more about Professor Satran, I want to remind those of you of our upcoming events and our next lecture, which will be preceded by a student art exhibit in our art gallery. Is going to be our first in-person lecture of the semester on February 18th, 7 p.m. Tutor Rayoni Padui on philosophy and the impossibility of wisdom, Socrates, Kant, Husserl. So for those of you who are local and on our campus, please consider joining us. David Satran is a now retired professor in the Department of Comparative Religion at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His research focuses on the relationship between philosophical and religious thought in Hellenistic Judaism and early Christianity, as well as on Jewish-Christian relations in late antiquity. He recently authored In the Image of Origin, Eros, Virtue, and Constraint in the Early Christian Academy. Professor Satran currently balances keeping up with grandchildren and reading great books that have eluded him. I want to add that I consider David a personal friend now and a good friend of St. John's College. I was just looking at a note he sent me right after we had a wonderful article in the New York Times about the college in September 2018, and he reminded me that we had met in Jerusalem in 2007, and he spoke some about his, and maybe this will come up in the question period, about his work directing and advising in, I don't know if you call it a Great Books program, but a program at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem with some shared DNA and origins to St. John's College. And since that time, we've stayed connected this way. And Professor Satran was going to be a visiting tutor here, leading a preceptorial in the spring of 2020. And we'd spent a couple of years planning for that. And it got canceled days before you and your wife were going to travel and spend time with us. And so it's kind of been a dream deferred to actually have a chance to converse with you. And I'm not going to say this is the dream fulfilled. I'll say this is a part of the dream fulfilled today. And we still want to have you come join us. You will, Professor Satran will give his talk about 45 minutes or so in this format. And then we will either go directly into questions in this webinar, or we may shift to the link to the Zoom meeting that will allow us to have some conversation face to face. We'll gauge where we are time wise and so on. And I think that David, you're willing to have questions come in the chat or Q&A even while you're presenting, and maybe those will get taken up on the go, or maybe they'll be saved till the end. Without further ado, please join me out there in the ether in welcoming David Satran to St. John's College in Santa Fe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Walter, and it's really a pleasure. And as you said, this has been a long time in the planning. Still not the full fruition of our plans, but it's a step in the direction. I want to really thank Dean Sterling, his office, and all the people at St. John's in Santa Fe that I've been in touch with in our attempts to keep the dream alive of actually coming to campus and teaching face to face. Perhaps together with that, I should say that the theme of this talk, which was really the talk was in a very different form, but was planned for April 2020 originally, before everything caved in on us. And the theme is perhaps a little bit dated, because it seemed to me then, coming to campus and speaking with students, faculty, that the theme of leaving home, coming back home, returning home was actually one that we all face and live with almost on an ongoing basis. And we've entered this strange time warp these last 2 years where coming and going perhaps have taken on a different meaning. Perhaps they've lost some of their meaning, but I hope nevertheless that reflections on homecoming and home leaving are still relevant and still have something to say to us. I'd also just like quickly to say that the text I'll be presenting, the presentation itself, is rather idiosyncratic. I'm largely going to be sharing texts which have interested me, concerned me over the years, or simply have charmed me in a certain sense. I hope there's some coherence to it, but I'm not sure that these are necessarily the most cogent texts or the texts that someone else would have chosen in presenting the theme. Okay, probably the most famous literary comparison or comparative study of two texts from the 20th century, and if not the most famous of all comparisons of literary texts from the 20th century, certainly the most famous comparison of Homer and the Bible is that we find in Eric Auerbach's Mimesis, the first chapter, Odysseus's Scar, where Auerbach famously compares Genesis 22, the story of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, the intended sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham, with book 19 of the Odyssey, Homer's description there of the discovery of Odysseus's scar by his nurse Eurycleia when he comes still disguised to the house and she bathes his legs. Undoubtedly, as I said, the most famous, and as we'll see, with some relevance for our theme, although perhaps tangentially. But if Auerbach presented the most noted description, Emmanuel Levinas, the famous French Jewish philosopher of the last century, certainly provided in short form, very short form, an almost equally influential comparison. In an essay which appeared initially in French in 1963, was translated and published in 1986, Levinas wrote, "To the myth of Ulysses returning to Ithaca, we would like to oppose the story of Abraham leaving his homeland forever for a yet unknown land." Interestingly, particularly for the fame and influence which Levinas's sentence has had over the last half century, or a little bit more in continental philosophical discourse, certainly, and probably a little more widely, interestingly, Levinas does not play out the theme. The sentence, the comparison, as we see it here, is more or less what we have there, and it's been left to Levinas's interpreters, his commentators, his partners in dialogue during the final decades of his life to try to tease out the meaning of it. Perhaps a good short description can be found in a very recent article by Vivian Liska, which I give right underneath, where she writes, Levinas distinguishes between Greek philosophy and Jewish thought via the opposition between Ulysses and Abraham's respective relations to place. Ulysses' journey is directed towards the eventual return to his fatherland, his Heimat. For Levinas, this is both a sign of turning in upon oneself and contrasts with Abraham's departure, which rather than being directed towards return to the land of his birth, is oriented solely towards a foreign destination, a terrain that is, so far, nothing but a promise. Between Ulysses and Abraham, as envisaged by Levinas, the fundamental difference between Greek and Jew is at stake, not just between the philosophical logos, but also between Homer and the Hebrew Bible. Okay, I'm not going to expand on Levinas's sentence itself. Perhaps if we would like, and I'm hoping that someone in the audience is actually better informed about continental philosophy than I am. But simply say quickly that when Levinas writes what he does, he clearly has two principal figures in the background. One, his teacher, Heidegger, who clearly was, amongst other things, the philosopher of the homeland, the philosopher of the return of the fatherland. But perhaps even more directly, in a way, a more distant figure, namely Hegel, who in one of his youthful compositions, a theological writing, The Spirit of Christianity and Its Fate, presented an enlarged description of Abraham and Abraham's journey in what I think can only be described as less than complimentary terms vis-a-vis the role that the Bible and eventually the Jewish religion would have to play in world history. But we'll leave that for the moment, as we will also, probably the most famous commentary on Levinas's statement by Derrida, which appears in a number of different writings. But what I'd like to do is, in a certain sense, question the opposition and really raise the possibility that if we look both at ancient sources commenting aware of both Homer and the Bible, and even some modern ones, perhaps this opposition is not quite as great as Levinas would present. First, just to get texts in front of us and make sure we're all on the same page. I don't think it takes a great deal of argument or convincing to persuade all of you that the Odyssey is in fact the great poem of return. It has the word embedded in it, the idea of homecoming, almost everywhere. Here I have just the first 9 verses of the poem. Tell me, muse, of the man of many ways, who has driven far journeys after he had sacked Troy's sacred citadel. Many were they whose cities he saw, whose minds he learned of, many the pains he suffered in his spirit on the wide sea, struggling for his own life and the homecoming of his companions. Even so, he could not save his companions, hard though he strove to. They were destroyed by their own wild recklessness, fools who devoured the oxen of Helios, the sun god, and he took away the day of their homecoming. Okay, and here we see the word nostos, or the accusative noston, and then as an adjectival form, the homecoming day. And in fact, as critics have noted for centuries, Homer's poem is in fact, in many ways, a combination of a different number of legends, one of which must have been a whole cycle of stories about the nostos, about the homecoming of the different heroes after following the Trojan War. It's interesting to see to what extent precisely around this theme it's opposed, or at least provides a complement to the Iliad. And here, a very famous section from book 9 of the Iliad, where Achilles is explaining his dual fate or dual destiny. For my mother, Thetis, the goddess of the silver feet, tells me I carry 2 sorts of destiny toward the day of my death. Either if I stay here and fight beside the city of the Trojans, my return home is gone, but my glory shall be everlasting. But if I return home to the beloved land of my fathers, the excellence of my glory is gone, but there will be a long life left for me, and my end in death will not come to me quickly. Okay, as you can see, as Achilles presents the problem, there is a choice between returning home and achieving glory, between nostos and kleos. He can have one or the other, but not both. In the case of Achilles, they're irreconcilable. In the case of Odysseus, though, he's kleos, his honor precisely depends upon his nostos, his homecoming. Everything that he is honored for, everything that he is remembered for, is tied closely with precisely this ability to stay the course, to remain firm, and to achieve his homecoming. The other text, of course, is from the Bible, from the book of Genesis. And what I'd like to do first, though, is not look at Genesis 12:1, the text which Levinas referenced up above, but rather look at the text that Auerbach placed in the center of his investigation. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you. In fact, Genesis 22, the text of the test of Abraham through the proposed sacrifice of Isaac, forms the closing note or the closing chord on the story that begins in Genesis 12. And as biblical scholars have long noticed, and as rabbinic exegetes noticed already 2,000 years ago, the two texts in fact correspond linguistically. I'll read Genesis 12:1 and then perhaps refer very quickly to the Hebrew. Genesis 12:1, the very beginning of the Abraham cycle, it goes, now the Lord said to Abram, go from your land and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Okay, and that's the text that will be in the center of our investigation over the next half hour or so. But if we just very quickly point out that while it disappears somewhat in the English translation, and no translation has really succeeded in preserving it, the Hebrew has a real shared cadence between these two verses. There's a triple effect. The Hebrew of the Genesis 22 is Kachna et bincha et yechidcha et asher ahavta. Isaac is characterized as your son, your only one, or your only son, the one whom you love. Okay, and this raises a whole series of questions because we know that Ishmael is in the background, questions which exegetes have troubled themselves with, but we'll leave those to the side for the moment. And then the command to Abraham is Lech Lecha. That's in boldface. Go. And it's a strengthened go. It's sort of go out. And in Genesis 12:1, we have Lech Lecha, and then the triple, that same triple construction. Me'artzecha, mimoladecha, umibet avicha. Go out from your land and from your kindred and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. Okay, and there are other grammatical and syntactic constructions within these two verses that draw them together, but I'll leave that for now. That's not what's at the center, but simply to say that 12:1 and 22, 1 through 2, corresponds closely. And in fact, in the rabbinic understanding of Abraham, there's a famous idea of 10 trials which Abraham had to face. Genesis 12 presents the first of the trials, the going out, and Genesis 22, the sacrifice of Isaac, is the 10th, the final trial. But let's see how these texts were picked up during the early centuries of the Common Era. Okay, first in line is Philo of Alexandria. Okay, Philo, the first great Jewish exegete and philosopher, living in Alexandria, working with Greek, in Greek, from the Greek Bible, from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Bible, provided us with a whole slew of compositions which are very close exegeses that are basically spiritualizing commentaries on the text of Genesis. And here's the very beginning of the composition on the migration of Abraham, which takes up the verse we've just seen. And the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your land, and from your kindred, and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. And Philo comments, God begins the carrying out of his will to cleanse man's soul by giving it a starting point for full salvation in its removal out of three localities: body, sense perception, and speech. Land, or earth, is a symbol of body. Kindred, of sense perception. Father's house, of speech. Okay, and a little bit further on in the text, Philo continues, depart therefore out of the earthly matter that surrounds you. Escape, man, from the foul prison house, thy body, with all thy might and strength, and from the pleasures and lusts that act as its jailers. Depart also out of sense perception, thy kin, for at present you have made a loan of thyself to each sense, and have thrown away the good thing that was thine own. But if you desire to recover your own self, and to have your own possessions about thee, letting no portion of them be alienated and fall into other hands, you shall claim instead a happy life, enjoying the benefit and pleasure derived from good things, not foreign to you, but your own. And also leave aside speech, your father's house, for it is unnatural that shadow should be preferred to substance or a copy to an original. Verbal expression is like a shadow or copy, while the essential nature of the matters conveyed by words resembles the substance and original. Obviously, we could spend much longer than we have on this single text from Philo, but I'll simply note before passing on that he's done something rather different, perhaps rather different than what we expected with this text. It's highly philosophical exegesis or commentary on the text. It reveals Philo's strong Platonic background, although in fact, most students of Philo today regard him as an eclectic philosopher of the time, more Middle Platonist than strictly Platonist, and also influenced strongly by Stoic tendencies. But here the Platonic themes come out clearly. And as you can see, the exegetical method at work is the one that we generally call allegory. That is, reading a text as something else, reading it into another plane or onto another level of meaning. Roughly around the same time as Philo, perhaps just a few decades later, we can't date the letter to the Hebrews from the New Testament precisely, but at some point in the 1st century of the Common Era, an anonymous author, once identified as Paul, and the letter to the Hebrews was usually classified or categorized among Paul's letters. We know that isn't the case. In fact, by the 3rd, 4th century, many Christian authors, theologians knew, in fact, that the letter to the Hebrews could not be Paul's own, but nevertheless, a fascinating window into a certain type of what I might call Jewish Christianity of the 1st century of the Common Era, that is probably some sort of Jewish congregation moving toward or into a belief in Jesus and perhaps leaving Judaism as a result, related to the story of Abraham's departure as follows. And this is from chapter 11, the famous chapter devoted to tales of faith. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he set out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he stayed for a time in the land he had been promised, as in a foreign land, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. All of these died in faith without having received the promises, but from a distance they saw and greeted them. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth. For people who speak in this way make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. if they had been thinking of the land that they had left behind, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, he has prepared a city for them. Here too, we have a form of spiritualizing exegesis, probably, although the terms are somewhat problematic, we generally are more comfortable speaking about this as a form of figurative exegesis, perhaps typological exegesis, a prefiguration where Abraham stands in place for some future promise, for some future fulfillment. And rather different than Philo, who talks about going out without any sense of return, at least not explicitly, the letter to the Hebrews, the author of the letter to the Hebrews, very clearly has in mind a homeland that those who have gone out are seeking. That is, the migration, the departure is towards someplace. And so the home leaving aspect of the text may have been muted somewhat. This line of spiritualizing exegesis comes in a way to its full fruition, to its peak in the Christian theologian, philosopher, exegete Origen, first of Alexandria, then later of Caesarea in Palestine, who lived at the end of the 2nd and the beginning of the 3rd century. Sorry, mistake in the dates I see now. It should be 185 through 254. He was precocious, but he didn't write as many commentaries all in his teens. He lived till 254 when he died, probably on his way to martyrdom. And here in his commentary on the Gospel of John, Origen takes up a problem facing the exegete, that what does it mean when John in chapter 8, we'll see the verse in a moment, says, if you are children of Abraham, do the works of Abraham. And Origen says, well, clearly we can't be expected to do the works of all the works of Abraham. And some of the works of Abraham, we certainly shouldn't be expected to do. And he thinks particularly in terms of Abraham's domestic arrangements, both in terms of his wives, his treatment of Ishmael, his treatment of Sarah, on going down to Egypt, and various other unpleasant aspects of the biblical text, which can't have been in the mind of the author of the Gospel of John. And Origen explains it thus. We also learn from this quite clearly that we must interpret the whole story of Abraham allegorically, that is, in a spiritual vein, and make each thing he did spiritual, beginning with the command, go forth from your land, your kindred, and your father's house into the land that I will show you. This statement is made not only to Abraham, but also to everyone who will be his child. For prior to the time we receive the divine command, we each have a certain land and kinship that is not good, as well as a house of our fathers, before the word of God encounters us. It is because of all these things, according to the word of God, that we will have to go forth, if indeed we hear the Savior saying, if you are children of Abraham, do the works of Abraham. For it is in this way, when we have left our land, that we will arrive at that land which God will show us, which is truly good and really abundant, and which the Lord God appropriately gives to those who have done what has been commanded in the words, go forth from your land. Okay, and Origen, in a certain sense, has taken themes both from Philo and from the letter to the Hebrews, melded them and brought them into full form and used this piece of exegesis in order to explain or perhaps solve a crux in the Gospel of John. What's clear is that Origen too sees Abraham's going out in its spiritual sense as leading towards a different sort of home, eventually though towards a homecoming itself. Okay, and so here too, we may have departed somewhat from that sharp antinomy which Levinas saw between the command to Abraham and the tale of Odysseus. One last text, and this one is a bit tricky. I simply bring it to you both because I worked on it closely and it interests me, but also because I think it's just a tour de force. It's a remarkable piece of biblical interpretation, but it's biblical interpretation that comes in a very specific context. The text is attributed to one Gregory Thaumaturgus, or Gregory the Wonder Worker. Now, there was a figure by that name who lived in the 3rd century. We're not quite sure whether he was actually a student of Origen, and we're really not sure whether this text should be attributed to him at all. But one thing is sure is that we have a rather substantial text of some 30 pages. That is a text of real substance that was written by a student of Origen's on leaving his academy or schoolhouse. Academy may be slightly too elevated a word. It may have been more like what we call in rabbinic terms a Beit Midrash, that is a sort of schoolhouse teacher and a few disciples. When he leaves the schoolhouse of Origen, sometime probably in the 230s or 240s, that is toward the middle of the 3rd century. What becomes clear as the text goes on with a wonderful description of the education that he received there and of Origen as a teacher is that he leaves under some measure of duress. And it's not quite clear whether of his own free will, whether this is a decision that he's had to make because of some pressure exerted upon him, or in fact, whether perhaps, and that's where I know my own instinct lies, that Origen has told him that it's time to move on. You've been here long enough. It's time to re-engage with the world. And this Gregory, if that's in fact his name, writes in this way, and you'll see that we're going to here combine themes from the first chapters of Genesis with Genesis 12, the text which we've seen up until now. He writes, "For I am driven out, not knowing what is wrong or for what transgression I am sent forth. I do not know what there is to say, but I have begun to speak as though I am a second Adam, cast out of paradise. How lovely it was to live listening to the teacher speak as I kept silent. How profitable it would be to live in quietness by keeping silent even now, rather than, as in the strange scene, turning my teacher into a listener." And the reference probably here is almost certainly to the fact that he's giving this valedictory speech. He's leaving his teacher, and probably as part of the ceremony of setting out and leaving one's teacher, having to speak in front of him, essentially show what he's learned over the years that he spent in Origen's presence. And he's going to do so precisely by using a piece of Origen's exegesis, the piece that we've just seen, and give it a personal twist. He continues, "I see myself as disobeying by daring to contravene the words of God when I ought to stay in the same place with the same people. But I am leaving, fleeing from this blessed life as much as did that man of old from the face of God as he turned back to the earth from which he had been taken." All references to Adam. "I abandon the concerns which are beautiful and good. And back I go again to what I had left behind, the land I came from, my earthly relatives, and my father's house. While I leave the good land where I obtained the good homeland I never knew of before, and relatives whom once I possessed them, I began later to know them as soulmates, and the house which is truly our Father's, where the Father dwells and is nobly honored and celebrated by his true sons who wish to remain there. I, on the other hand, neither noble nor worthy, leave all these things as I turn back and retrace my steps." The grieving student has in fact inverted or perhaps controverted the theme of Genesis 12 and talks about returning to his land, wherever that may have been. Some think Cappadocia, modern day Eastern Turkey, then Asia Minor, the land he came from, his earthly relatives, and his father's house. These are the places he now has to go back to, leaving behind the good land, the good homeland, and the true father's house, namely the academy in which he had been privileged to study all these years. So it's a rather daring use of the exegesis of Abraham 12 in order to talk about actually having to leave, but in quite the opposite manner which it had been originally intended. Up until now, we've been looking at texts relating to Genesis 12:1 and Abram's departure and this idea of leaving, and whether it's actually leaving or it's leaving toward the goal of homecoming, perhaps in a different sense. And it's interesting to look at a text that's contemporaneous with Origin and Origen's student, perhaps written only slightly later. And this is from the great Neoplatonist philosopher Plotinus, in fact, the founder of the school of Neoplatonism in the 3rd century. And it appears in the compendium of his discourses, of his teachings, called the Aeneads, compiled by his student Plotinus during the final decades of the 3rd century after Plotinus's death. And here in Aeneid 1:6, dedicated to the theme of beauty, okay, we find one of the most interesting ancient exegeses of the Odysseus legend. And it may allow us to think a little bit about what we've seen thus far regarding both Abraham and Odysseus. And the question is, how do we ascend to beauty? How then can we do this? What technique should we employ? How can one see the inconceivable beauty which remains in a way within the sacred temple, not venturing outside, lest the uninitiated should see it? Indeed, let him who is able to go and follow it inside, leaving outside the sight of his eyes, not allowing himself to turn back to the splendor of the bodies he previously saw. For when he does see beauty in bodies, he should not run after them, but realize that they are images and traces and shadows, and flee towards that of which they are images. Someone would be better advised to say, let us flee to our beloved fatherland. Brief quotation, citation from the Iliad. But what is this flight and how is it accomplished? Let us sail in the way Homer, in an allegorical way, I think, tells us that Odysseus fled from the sorceress Circe or from Calypso. Odysseus was not satisfied to remain there, even though he had visual pleasures and passed his time with sensual beauty. Our fatherland, from where we actually have come, and our father are both in the intelligible world. What is our course and what is our means of flight? We should not rely on our feet to get us there, for our feet just take us everywhere on earth, one place after another. Nor should you saddle up a horse or prepare some seagoing vessel. You should put aside all such things and stop looking. Just shut your eyes and change your way of looking and wake up. Everyone has this ability. Oh, sorry, I've lost it there for a moment. Everyone has this ability. Sorry, it's run away from me. Everyone has this ability, but few use it. Plotinus stands in a long line of exegesis to the Homeric poems. We know that this began back, well, probably in classical times, certainly in the Hellenistic period, and most famously in the school of Alexandria, but also in other places. And we know that from an early stage, Homer's poems, both the Iliad and the Odyssey, were in fact treated allegorically, largely by Stoic commentators, but also by Platonic ones. And Plotinus here, standing in the Platonic tradition, in fact, opening a new chapter in the Platonic tradition, gives us a real insight into how Homer was read and how the Odyssey was considered. And I think at this point, we've seen enough to realize that both the Odyssey and the story of Abraham's departure, however different their frameworks may have looked when we read just Homer or the Bible itself, through the prism of exegesis in the early centuries of the Common Era, they've come rather closer than the sort of opposition that Levinas had presented. In fact, both the story of Abraham and the story of Odysseus seem to share a whole series of common features and are principally read allegorically, of course, as stories about leaving behind the false earthly home in order to achieve a true homecoming and to find the true homeland. Now, if allegorical exegesis in the ancient world brought the two stories rather closer than we might have thought, as time goes on, they come closer, but from a different direction. And here, it might help if we skip ahead some 1,000 years, and we're going to be sort of leaping wildly at this point, all the way up into the High Middle Ages, and of course, Dante, who, writing some 2,000 years after Homer, the 1,000 years after Origen and Plotinus, changes the whole course of the Odysseus legend. As we know, and I won't expand here beyond the verses that we have in front of us, his presentation of Odysseus, or Ulysses, as he knows him, is not the hero of homecoming, but rather the hero, if one wants, of great ambition and of folly. Okay, the question of how Dante related to Ulysses, how he intended for us to understand the presentation in the 26th chapter of the Inferno is one that scholars debate, but it certainly is no longer the Ulysses or the Odysseus of classical tradition. And we hear Ulysses there say, neither my fondness for my son, nor pity for my old father, nor the love I owed Penelope, which would have gladdened her, was able to defeat in me the longing I had to gain experience of the world and of the vices and the worth of men. Okay, that is, it's not homecoming which drives him, it's rather the gaining of experience of the world. Therefore, I set out on the open sea with but one ship, and that small company of those who never had deserted me. Brothers, I said, oh, you who have crossed 100,000 dangers, reach the west to this brief waking time that still is left. Unto your senses, you must not deny experience of that which lies beyond the sun and of the world that is unpeopled. And probably, or at least among the most famous lines in the Commedia, consider well the seed that gave you birth. You were not made to live your lives as brutes, but to be followers of worth and knowledge. I spurred my comrades with this brief address to meet the journey with such eagerness that I could hardly then have held them back. Okay, and then at the very end of the canto, at the end of Canto 26, we hear the conclusion, and we were glad, but this soon turned to sorrow, for out of that new land the whirlwind rose and hammered out our ship against her bow. 3 times it turned her round with all the waters, and at the 4th it lifted up the stern, so that our prow plunged deep, as pleased another, until the sea again closed over us. Okay, no homecoming, no nostos here for Ulysses of Dante, and it's fair to say that Dante has, in a way, changed the course of every reading, certainly every creative reading of Homer since that time. It's hard to think of another reworking of the Odysseus tale or of the Ulysses legend, which hasn't in some way had to take account of Dante's spectacularly bold and individual reading. Okay. What I would like to do, and we're really at the point where I should be wrapping up, is in fact to wrap up by taking a look at this somewhat different Odysseus, this Odysseus who may make it home, but it's certainly not the homecoming that Homer had presented to us. It's not the heroic homecoming, the nostos, that we read of in the Odyssey, but something, I don't know whether we want to say diminished, but something rather different. And to do this through two modern poets. The first, as you might guess, is the great Greek Alexandrian poet Cavafy, whose famous poem Ithaca begins, "As you set out on the way to Ithaca, hope the road is a long one, filled with adventures, filled with discoveries." Okay, and skipping over to the final stanzas of that poem, he wrote, "Always in your mind keep Ithaca. To arrive there is your destiny, but do not hurry your trip in any way. Better that it last for many years, that you drop anchor at the island, an old man, rich with all you've gotten on the way, not expecting Ithaca to make you rich. Ithaca gave you the beautiful journey. Without her, you wouldn't have set upon the road, but now she has nothing left to give you. And if you find her poor, Ithaca didn't deceive you. As wise as you will have become with so much experience, you will understand by then these Ithacas, what they mean." Okay, and one last stop, a poem that corresponds interestingly with the poem by Cavafy, although far less well known, by a modern Israeli poet, Chaim Gori, who died just a number of years ago, one of the great Israeli poets of the 1940s right through the early part of the 21st century. He wrote poetry over the course of 6 decades. And in 1960, wrote his own Odysseus. And if possible, I'd like to close simply by reading you Chaim Gori's poem. It's a good translation of it, loses a bit from the Hebrew, but I think beautiful in its own right. "And returning to the city of his birth, he found the sea and different fish and grass floating on the lazy waves and the frail sun in the fringes of the sky. A misstep always recurs," said Odysseus in his weary heart, and returned to the crossroads near the neighboring city to find a way beyond water to the city of his birth. A weary pilgrim, dreamy and homesick, among people who spoke a different Greek. The words he took along as food for the journey had died meanwhile. For a moment, he thought he'd slept many days and come back to people who weren't surprised to see him and didn't stare in wide-eyed disbelief. He questioned them with gestures and they tried to understand him from out of the distance. The purple turned more violet in the fringes of the selfsame sky. The adults stood up and took the children circling round him and pulled them away. And light after light turned yellow in house after house. Dew came down on his head. Wind came kissing his lips. Water came bathing his feet like aged Euryclea, and didn't see the scar and continued down the slope as water does. Thank you very much. And I don't know that we've in any way resolved the problem of homecoming as opposed to home leaving, but I guess I've just simply tried to suggest that perhaps the two are irresolubly mixed, and that precisely as one's leaving, one is also coming. As one's coming, one might in fact not actually be coming home at all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for a wonderful talk. And we would like to have questions and conversation. We have one that's been queued up here, and I'm going to suggest we just stay in the webinar here, since we know some folks will be summoned to class in a bit. We'd love to have some questions and conversation here. Do you want to take a short break, David, or can we move right into it?
No, I think we can move on.
Okay.
Is there? Tell me, Walter, simply in the webinar format, is there any way for me to see participants, or
we can invite people to
if they would like? I mean, without any pressure,
yeah.
obviously. But
so I see we have one that's written, and I think we'll probably just start by reading that, and the questioner can let us know if they'd like to join us. We can put anybody onto live voice or video or both. But let's start with this question from tutor David Bolleton, and I'll go ahead and, if you're okay with it, David, I'll go ahead and read it out loud for the audience, since they can't see it, and then you can respond. You should be able to see it if you open the Q&A. Mr. Bolleton asks, I wonder if Homer's Odyssey shouldn't be understood less simply as a celebration of homecoming. After all, in the Proemium, Odysseus is said to have been seeking, quote, his own life, end quote, not his homecoming, and the homecoming of, quote, of his comrades. And of course, as Dante emphasized, he wasn't always in such a single-minded pursuit of his return. And even after his return, he told Penelope that he would have to go on another long journey. Weren't Dante and Cavafy right in emphasizing this less social and more individual aspect of Homer's Odysseus?
Okay, David, thank you. Good question, and let me just cut to the chase and say right at the start, yes, you're obviously right. I've simplified matters somewhat and probably polarized them by doing so. Odysseus's return is deeply problematic. He is of more than two minds about it. I think we could say it happens, but it happens gradually. It happens only slowly, and he has doubts and hesitations all along. And even when the return has been effected, it's not smooth. So, you know, I shouldn't take too long simply to say I agree with you. You're certainly right. Having said that, Dante clearly goes far beyond anything Homer might have indicated. Dante really, and I tend to agree with those readers, modern readers of Dante, who feel that Dante, in fact, is being critical, despite the fact that he, as he so successfully does throughout the Inferno and throughout the Commedia as a whole, arouses our sympathy, or plays with our sympathy, perhaps. He doesn't really intend for us to think that Odysseus was as noble or as virtuous a figure as perhaps we'd like to. Perhaps we identify too closely. Might be Dante's message. In fact, a question in this, I'll simply leave and won't push it any further. But the question, which a number of, I think, very acute readers of Dante have asked, is the extent to which Dante himself identifies with Odysseus as his unconverted self, the extent to which Dante may, in writing the Commedia and in presenting Odysseus there in Inferno among the fraudulent counselors, maybe in a way paying dues, his own dues to a certain extent, for his previous, I don't know, we'll call it philosophical arrogance of a sort, his sense that philosophy would get him all the way, and not faith. But that's a question over which there's so much discussion that probably best leave it. In a certain sense, it's simply last sentence. I think in a way, Chaim Gori's Dante, Chaim Gori's Odysseus might be even more faithful in that sense to Homer's Odyssey. That in a certain sense, there is the return, but it's the return of someone who's confused, someone who may not know all the rules, someone who has to relearn quite a bit once he's come back. But perhaps I'll add something on about Gori and his vision of Ulysses a little bit later on. Thank you, though.
Thank you. David, we have Michael Golliber, who I'm going to turn on his microphone. I wonder if you might end the screen share. We'll be able to see you a little better. I might be able to do that too, but if you're able to. I'm going to go
sure.
ahead.
No, I can do that. Yeah, good idea. Let's get it out of there.
Michael, are you there, Mr. Golliber?
I am here, yes.
Would you like us to turn the video on or just?
Sure, I don't mind, yeah.
Okay, give me just a moment.
While you're getting me on, I just wanted to thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I had never quite thought about the connection between Abraham and Odysseus in that way. And I want to think much further about it. I was going to ask pretty much this.
Michael, excuse me. You can turn your video. I think you should be able to turn your video on if you'd like. There we go. Oh, I had you for a second. Okay. There we go.
I was going to ask a very similar question that David Ballatin just asked. I'm one of those who reads Dante as getting Odysseus right. And I wanted to point out that in books 11 and 23 of the Odyssey, there's a prophecy from Tiresias, or it's instruction that he has got to go leave again Ithaca, which is, it could be the kind of false home that you were talking about. And he's got to go very far inland to a place that isn't near the sea at all, where his ore will be mistaken as a winnowing pan. He's got to plant it. And it looks like it's a new founding of some sort that is the real goal of Odysseus. So I too wanted to question the dichotomy that Levinas seems to be making, but from the other way around. And you don't have to say any more about that. But since that question was asked, I was wondering if I could ask a more maybe timely and practical question, although controversial. And I'm just wondering what your talk suggests about Judaism's attachment to Israel as a homeland and Zionism. And I thought that might be in the background of this. So you can, however you want to go about approaching either of those questions or just one. Thank you.
Okay, Michael, thank you very much. That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that aspect of it. Some of the, in a way, from the direction you suggested, relativizing the homecoming aspect, or at least putting a different sort of perspective on the Homeric homecoming. And that's interesting. I'd like to think about that some more. I appreciate that. Both your comment and David's are going to force me back to think more about Odysseus himself, Odysseus as we meet him in Homer. The second question is one that I sort of anticipated, decided not to go there in the talk, but clearly it's a natural question, and I think if I had more time, or perhaps had decided to pitch the talk differently, I could well have devoted some attention to the question of how does Abraham's departure, how does Genesis 12:1 look in 19th and 20th century Jewish thought? How is it played out in that way? And there's much to be said. and not all of it simple, I think. Levinas himself, and I should make this clear, Levinas presents this strong opposition, and in other places hints, without using the Abraham-Odysseus antithesis, hints and even indicates strongly that for him, Abraham is the symbol of a sort of eternal Jewish spirit, which is not tied to land, which does not return home. That is, it's for Levinas, obviously, it has to do with the move from what he calls from the self or from the same to the other. Whereas, you know, he wants to place Odysseus as paradigmatic of the Western tradition, returning to the same, coming back to the same place, as opposed to Judaism, which reaches out to the other. And yet Levinas, and certainly Levinas in the last 20 years of his life, was not an anti-Zionist.
Right.
Levinas may not have been an ardent Zionist, at least, you know, by some definitions of the term, but he clearly accepted the state of Israel, I think celebrated the state of Israel, but wanted to maintain something of a balance here. And while I don't think he ever gave it the full expression, which I hope to find, it's actually the place where it comes out most clearly, and they're the most difficult places to actually present in a format like this, are in his Talmudic readings, where I think you find his harshest, or in a way his most biting criticisms of the state as state and the nature of Israel as a modern state. He never wants actually to take that paradigm of Abraham to its full. You know, he lays it out there, but he doesn't really want to see it in actuality. And so it's there with attention. It's very interesting, but from a very different standpoint. I mean, think of a very different thinker than Levinas is Rabbi Soloveitchik. Yosef Soloveitchik, probably the greatest Orthodox Jewish thinker of the 20th century, who in his own way tried to build something of a common world between the Western tradition and the Jewish tradition. He too sees Abraham as this voyager who also is a man of community. For him, it becomes Abraham who both leaves everything behind and yet creates something new. And again, trying to play with that. What I didn't bring up, although I had actually thought to put it up, and perhaps I'll, shall I read it for you? Let me do that. We may as well. Do we have time for another 2 minutes, Walter?
Sure, absolutely.
I'd like to give Michael as honest an answer as I can, and what I'm going to have to do, unfortunately, is open up for myself a document so I can read it out, because I had left it behind, but it's there. Okay, and I simply, out of curiosity, did a little bit of searching on Israel government web pages, and it didn't take too long to find on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website a page called The Land of Promise. Okay. And it reads like this. I'll simply read it out to you. Abraham, the father of Israel, was the first person to spread the idea of monotheism, belief in one God. God commanded him to leave his birthplace and go to the land that I will show you. Abraham's migration to the land of Israel was the beginning of a long journey that the people of Israel would travel before finally settling in their land. And it goes on for a little bit, but clearly for the author, at least of this webpage, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it's a journey home. It's a homecoming in every sense. I mean, the home leaving, which simply resounds in 12:1, and which Levinas celebrates for an Israeli government website, becomes actually just the launching point for A Tale of Homecoming. So again, one can use it in various ways. There are lots of other Jewish texts that I might have pulled in, but we'll leave that for another time and another conversation. But thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Did you want to follow up at all?
I have a lot to ask. I'll leave room for others.
Okay, we have another question in the chat thread, but hang around if you can, and we can circle back around. So we have a question from Dan Grifferty. Auerbach in Odysseus's Scar, which you referenced, focuses a lot on the differences in style between Genesis and the Odyssey, specifically hypotaxis versus parataxis. What do we make of this in light of the themes of homecoming, home leaving?
Okay, I may have to move this one back in Dan's direction if he's still on and can either write or join us, because I'm not sure. Do you mean, can we somehow use Auerbach's terms to discuss the themes of homecoming, home leaving? That is Auerbach's stylistic terms. I'm not sure I know how to do that. If that was the intention, I'm not quite sure how to do that. And maybe you have some sense of how we might do that. Auerbach, as you know, as you indicate, and as we know, really gives over a large part of that chapter to precisely to the question of style. That is how a story is told, how a narrative is spun out, and has some very interesting and I think somewhat paradoxical things to say about where realism lies. And that's obviously going to be his theme.
It looks like, let's just see.
If you can bring Dan on, that would be.
Dan, I can try to activate you here and see if this, there, I think you're with us.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm in the coffee shop, so it might be a bit loud. But basically my question concerned in Auerbach, the way he describes it, it seems to me is that the difference between using a lot of like silence in between what's actually presented in the text, like in Genesis, and in the Odyssey, it seems like everything is like very described, and there's a lot of like images that are brought up. And Auerbach seems to say that you're actually told more in Genesis by there being more silence in between things, or you're told less in the Greek account. So I was just wondering if maybe the authors of these texts chose to do things in that way to reflect the themes that are going on, like homecoming and home leaving. I'm not sure if anybody has any ideas about that.
Quickly, Dan, I'm not sure whether I'd try to tie it directly to the themes. It certainly is true of the account. Possibly one would say, you know, the accounts in Genesis of the patriarchs. Clearly, Auerbach, you know, sort of cherry picked, and that's the nature of the whole volume of Mimesis, that he chooses, and he chooses remarkably, you know, with real brilliance, the scenes he wants to contrast, and certainly these two are done that way. But I don't think he's being unfair or unrepresentative. I mean, I think the sort of silence that he speaks about in characterizing Genesis 22 is true in many places. I'm not sure generally throughout the Bible whether I'd want to say that, but certainly in the book of Genesis. And it works here as well. It's one of the reasons why the book of Genesis, perhaps biblical books in general, have encouraged the sort of commentary and exegesis which they have. That is, while some of it is allegorical, and in that way, like the exegesis of the Homeric works in late antiquity, much of it isn't allegorical, and it's simply an attempt to fill in the story and make the story more potent. I would mention in that, you know, perhaps, I don't know whether it speaks for or against the use of Auerbach here, is that I spent a bit of time with the rabbinic exegesis of Genesis 12:1, and I think I would characterize it perhaps too broadly, but I'd characterize it as disappointing. That is, that it's not one of the richer passages in terms of discussion, particularly by the rabbis in the midrashic literature. So I don't know whether that speaks to the point or not. I was hoping for a bit more. In fact, it's a little bit weak in that sense, as opposed, for example, to the rabbinic exegesis of Genesis 22, which is outstanding. I mean, quite remarkable. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up really quick?
Absolutely.
So I've heard in the rabbinic tradition of Genesis 22, like specifically the binding of Isaac, it's acknowledged that Isaac was a grown man who was aware of what was happening to him. Does that change anything, do you think, with this account of home leaving, like the sort of the price that has to be paid by Abraham?
Well, I don't know whether Isaac's age, which, clearly, the rabbis appreciated that according to the chronology of things, it was likely to be far beyond what we tend to picture or imagine in our minds. I don't know whether that necessarily, but I think they have a broad sense. They certainly have this broad sense that Abraham pays a constant price for his leaving home, that he never sees that this is a promise for the future and not one that he ever sees realized or can ever truly appreciate, that he remains for the rabbis a figure constantly, as I indicated at the beginning of my remarks, constantly being tested, never being really left at peace. So I'm not sure whether that precisely works to it. There's a wonderful, Dan, I don't know, again, we're far from the rabbis with this, although I'm not sure. I think the rabbis might have appreciated some of Kafka's parables and paradoxes, but he has a wonderful one regarding Abraham, which might cut across the grain of all of this. But if you'll give me just a moment, and if it's okay, Walter, I'll read just a brief section of it. This appears first in a letter that he writes to one of his correspondents, a medical doctor who he's in correspondence with, and then within the collection of his parables and paradoxes, Kafka proposes a series of Abrahams, a series of alternative Abrahams. And one of them goes like this. He says, I could conceive of another Abraham for myself. He certainly would have never gotten to be a patriarch or even an old clothes dealer who was prepared to satisfy the demands for a sacrifice immediately with the promptness of a waiter. But he was unable to bring it off because he could not get away. Being indispensable, the household needed him. There was perpetually something or other to be put in order. The house was never ready. Without having his house ready, without having something to fall back on, he could not leave this. The Bible also realized, for it says, and then he quotes, he set his house in order. And in fact, Abraham possessed everything in plenty to start with. If he had not had a house, where would he have raised his son? And in which rafter would he have stuck the sacrificial knife? So I don't know, some of that is just Kafkan playfulness, but some of it is this perhaps also Kafkan serious reflection on what does it mean to either have or not have a house or a home, and how does that then impinge upon what you do afterwards or not. Would a different Abraham, an Abraham who had not followed that first command to leave his country, his kindred, and his father's house, have ever possibly thought or been able to follow that ultimate command of sacrificing Isaac. I don't know. I'm not sure that that was the direction you were pushing me in, Dan, but that's
Very interesting. Thank you.
okay. There's, you know, of course, you know, we'll have to keep in mind, and I always try to, is that you know, it's not directly related to our theme, but it's the other end of Levinas's discussion of Abraham, and of course his great respect for Kierkegaard and his real interest in Kierkegaard's discussion of Abraham, of course, in Fear and Trembling, but also his criticism of Kierkegaard in thinking that Abraham's great faithfulness came in hearing the words of God to take Isaac and to go and sacrifice him. Levinas's correction is, no, the great act of faith was hearing God's later words telling him not to lay a hand upon the youth. That Abraham's greatness was hearing the second part of the command and not the first. And that becomes part of his discussion of, is there a suspension of the ethical? What does it mean to talk about a suspension of the ethical? But let's leave that. That's taking us otherwise in other directions.
David, I think I'm going to ask a question actually that picks up on that. And I'll just invite folks in the audience. I think we probably have time for one or two more questions if anybody wants to get in. I have a couple of questions. I might end up following up with them, but just to pick up on that point, it seems to me if one is joining Levinas and pushing the dichotomy, I mean, you could make a case that the possibility of a home leaving that's a distinct sort of ethical or ontological or spiritual journey, and not something that assimilates to homecoming in the way some of the authors take it, that might depend on an idea of a voice, a calling, a summons, a command, a kind of vocation that pulls us towards home leaving in that more radical way. Whereas you might say homecoming doesn't require that, right? I mean, the sort of call of homecoming is maybe already in us. It doesn't look like it needs that external voice, and of course that Levinas takes all of that in various interwoven directions. But do you have thoughts about that? Are those almost analytically tied concepts in a way, if one wants to make this, and I'm not sure you do, but wants to deepen the division between home leaving and homecoming in these traditions?
I think so. I think you put it beautifully, Walter, and in fact, it corresponds with perhaps my first, my early reflections on the theme and quizzical ones a bit were, why don't we have a word home leaving? Whereas homecoming is, obviously the Greeks had a word for it. Nostos meant just that. It wasn't simply a return, but it was a return home, as the word, certainly as the word develops and is understood. It's a specific sort of coming. It may have to do with some sort of perception, but it becomes the idea of homecoming. I think most languages have a term, a common term that's used for this idea of homecoming, whereas home leaving seems to be a neologism in almost every language. And I'll be happy if someone can, correct this, because there may be some tongue in which this in fact does exist. And I think that already, on a very basic level, is an indication of what you were saying, Walter, and I think so correctly, is that homecoming is somehow innate. It's within us. It's a natural part of who we are, and then becomes a natural part of our language. Whereas home leaving is a commitment, of a sort, as you said, a radical one. It's becomes, certainly in Levinasian terms, it is, as you put it, I think quite correctly, it's an ontological stance. It's a decision to live in a certain perpetual tension in an unnatural way. But I simply agree. I think that it's there, and it's perhaps also the explanation why so much of our exegesis, as we've seen it, turns home leavings into just another form of homecoming, a delayed homecoming, a future homecoming, an eschatological or a spiritualized homecoming, where it simply projects them.
Thank you. I might follow up with a question or two, but David Balaton asks something connected to this. I'm not sure if he was responding to what you had said before, or maybe to my question. He says, does Plato's allegory of leaving the cave require a call or a vocation? And I'm not, David, I'd be happy to turn your microphone on, but I'm not sure if that's meant to kind of challenge the dichotomy in a different way, or if his suggestion is that there is a call or a vocation there, or if his suggestion is that there's not. You can take up the question as it's written.
Okay. Wow, that's a great question, and obviously, David, we could spend a fair amount of time on that. I mean, you could say that the return to the cave, which clearly is being done under some duress, and demands certain conditions and demands a certain type of individual, is a form of home leaving, that having left the cave and come home, having seen, I mean, if we think of it in a sort of casting Plotinus backwards, having seen true beauty or the good, is it essentially then a remarkable act of home leaving to go back into the cave? I don't know whether those are the terms in which you were thinking of it, David, but it might be cast that way.
I think my interpretation of this question is that the leaving the cave could be just as much a home leaving of a sort, a real home leaving, as we're talking about in the biblical or Levinasian context, but that it doesn't seem to require a call or a vocation, that it's somehow happens, or we're moved to it, or it's in our nature without a call or a vocation. That's what I interpret as the possibility he's raising.
Okay. No, interesting. I just was able to glance at his question and his further expansion on it. I mean, you have a double movement there, and you have to decide. Interesting question, and that one I'd like to think about some more, and hopefully there'll be an opportunity at some point in the future, maybe perhaps even to think about it together.
I see. I had scrolled down and I see the further comments.
I just did now.
I think I was
David. David, thank you though. It's a wonderful question, a wonderful place to take this.
We have another question in the chat thread.
Oh, I see. We have a helpful comment from Sarah Klingenstein.
Do you want to go ahead and read it?
Yeah, so Sarah, you say per your earlier question about other languages, David, in classical Chinese, okay, and someone else is going to have to read the characters for me, I'm afraid. That's beyond me. Is literally leaving the home, and it means to become a Buddhist monk. And that's fascinating, because someplace I didn't go, and I'm sorry, I have a whole file of texts we didn't look at together, and that might have been fun to look at, is the use of the Abraham tradition in a number of monastic texts here, meaning Christian monastic texts, but perhaps one could explore comparatively the idea of leaving home within its monastic context and in a variety of cultural and religious frameworks. And it's very interesting. Thank you. It's interesting to know that in Chinese there is, an innate term for leaving home with that specific meaning in mind of taking monastic vows or becoming monastic. Thank you, Sarah. Walter, are there more questions?
I don't see more questions, so we might be. Yeah, please.
Could I just
Please.
2 minutes? And again, it was someplace where I didn't go, but I think it's someplace that's sort of between the lines. And I mentioned that I might come back and say another word about Chaim Gori's poem. Gori was notable among Israeli authors and altogether Israeli public individuals already in the late 40s and through the 50s for best to put this, for taking account of those who had lived through the horrors of the Holocaust. That is, while Holocaust survivors found Israel of the 1950s a very difficult place, because a young country built upon tales of bravery didn't always find a place and often suppressed those whose stories were ones of suffering and submission. Gori stood out and sort of offered at various points what I think you could describe as a public apology, saying those of us who didn't know the horrors of the Holocaust and were here in Israel, may have lived through a local war following the Second World War, but we have no idea what you experienced, and we owe you everything in a sense. And it's hard for me not to read his Odysseus in a certain sense, thinking of other people who came home, or perhaps to a home that they had only dreamed of, or a home they had only imagined, that a home they had never actually lived in, but came and found that they were not really invited in. That is, they remained somehow on the outside, that they didn't really understand. The Hebrew was not the Hebrew that they knew, in the way that Gori presents Odysseus as Greek as no longer being the Greek spoken. They were, in a way, remained outside. Their homecoming remained partial, remained never complete. And some scholars have gone so far as to say the literature of both the camps and the Gulag is really a literature of no homecoming. That is, the survivors never are allowed to return. They never are actually recognized as coming back, despite having survived. And that's a whole other question about how homecoming literature of the 20th century may have taken a very different turn than anything imagined before or put down on paper. But that's such a big theme that we probably shouldn't, and I should just hold my peace at this point.
Thank you so much for sharing your talk and for joining with us in conversation. And we hope this will be the first chapter of a continued discussion with you visiting us here in Santa Fe. Perhaps in the next academic year, we're able to get where we hoped to get a few years ago.
Okay. I earnestly, truly hope so, Walter, and I look forward to carrying on the conversation. And thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you, and thank you to all the participants and all those who are together with us.